This episode of Future Cities Africa is brought to you in partnership with Digital Council Africa. I know magic wands don't exist, but just imagine they do. I give you a magic wand and I say that you can change one piece of legislation or just the way we think or do things. What would that one thing be and why?
To allocate spectrum as quickly as possible so that mobile network operators can deploy at the pace and typically at the cost that they would like to. So that's also something that's very overdue. I think I would bring in some form of legislation around how we narrow the digital divide. That's a really big concern, is the digital divide and the growing digital divide. I would institute digital learning from a really early age for school children. That is something that we feel strongly about. There's, with lockdown coming into effect, there was approximately 6.4 million children that were left without access to any learning. And it's difficult for us to understand that, but a child in a rural community that cannot go to school suddenly is left further behind. And it's just this vicious cycle of those that can excel, and it's never been more evident than in COVID. So I would definitely put legislation in place that would help deploy telecommunications infrastructure to lower income areas and underserved areas. And all of this will hang off the rapid deployment policy, which is a critical piece of legislation that can help us achieve all these ambitious goals. But it is incredibly important that we start connecting underserved communities, that we revisit our learning platforms to make sure that we prepare the next generation for the digital era that we are entering, and that we make them a part of that, and that they can participate in the digital economy as we go forward.
But the one thing I would always want to say up the meter on is on the level of collaboration that we have. And it's, we exist in an ecosystem. The ecosystem is made of us as technology partners, network providers, you've got app developers, you've got device, you've got regulatory, you've got government, you've got the private sector, is always to up the level of collaboration, because that enables us to align in a direction that we're going and ensures efficiency in what we deliver. Because, time, it's all about time, and at time we never more pressed for time like we are now.
I don't know if it's a piece of legislation, but I think there's something about our, people, and this will sound a bit cliche, but there's something about our political administrative interface. And I know that's like a much used term. My colleague Danga at SACN talks quite a lot about this, and rightly so. But I do think there's something in there, because when I engage with officials, and SACN has been engaging a lot with officials in the government space, you begin to realize that there are a lot of people who probably, so I talked about skill, right? There are people who have the skill, maybe, and the understanding often, to actually do something different. But there's something that happens in the system that doesn't allow that to be actualized. Either people are not empowered enough, or people feel that they're blocked by the politics of the day, or they feel that the mandates are too tight. There's something about that space. There's something about what people think is their job and what they're responsible for that doesn't play quite right. So I would definitely do something around how government works and the extent to which officials feel that they have the space and the responsibility to be doing more. But I'd certainly use my second wish as well, and that would be on the private sector. We know that we're in a country that's extremely market driven, and where the economy is held in particular places. Maybe this comes back to the trust issue, to, people talked about, whether, do we have patriotic capital and this sort of thing. I don't use the language of patriotism much. I'm not much of a nationalist. But I do think this idea that I would try to tap my wand to get people to understand that our futures are interlinked, and there are things we need to do that are actually just sensible because they're good for everybody. And that if we had a bit of faith in that, and if we were willing invest in that there's something special we could do here. I've always believed, and maybe because I'm a newbie, I've been in South Africa for 20 years now, but I've always believed that this country could do special things. I don't think we do very many special things, and that disappoints me, and I think disappoints many people hugely. But perhaps those are two levers, I think. You know, if we had officials that really could get on with doing some amazing things, and then if we had an economy in terms of those who hold it, and I talked about power earlier, that really believed that this was a place worth trusting and investing themselves in for the many, not for the few, I think we could do amazing things. I think we could have smart cities.
From my experiences over the last several years, the biggest frustration I've had stopping most things is the frequency allocation, frequent spectrum allocation to various technologies. So this may seem like rather strange thing to say, but for example, the frequencies available for IoT are very limited. So it's very constrained, and the reason why we have a lot of limitations on the IoT, the frequencies are just not available. You know, we're struggling to get any of the frequencies for any of these technologies. So it's incredibly difficult to change that and move forward because of how they're allocated. But in other areas of the world, in Asia and America, they've got far better spread of their frequencies. So they can achieve a lot of things which can't be achieved in Europe and Africa.
I joked about this on Twitter the other day. I said I'd ban leaf blowers. I think that's a strong campaign promise. You can't mess up too much by doing that. But that's a joke, although not entirely a joke. I think we should seriously consider this on the tickets in general. But I think that the most important thing we need to do if we want to secure the future on a more serious basis is completely destroy really our education system that we've got right now, because I think that's where all the challenges come from. So whatever your political philosophy is, when you start digging under it, you start to understand that education is where it all goes wrong. So even if you are of a more sort of left-leaning persuasion than perhaps I might be myself, I'm quite anarchist myself, but if you follow the sort of Rawlsian school of thought, justice as fairness requires having a base understanding of how power and democracy work in order for it to be fair. That's what it comes down to, not actually distributing wealth, but distributing access to knowledge as a means to having power and agency in society. And our entire education system, this whole concept of compulsory schooling for children, is very dystopian for me. I mean, you're essentially sentencing children to 18 years of hard labor that they don't appreciate. And, you know, what do they get out of it? They have a limited worldview at the end of it, not an expanded worldview. And once again, it comes down to the fact that we weren't able to do that fairly even 50 years ago, because if you stopped having compulsory schooling then, only your richer children would have access to education at all, which is sort of self-defeating. It undoes what I was speaking about earlier. However, now the knowledge is essentially free, but the ability to learn is still requires effort and personal development. We no longer need compulsory schooling. We just need to, you know, put children in front of a screen that has access to all the knowledge in the world. And you can talk about things like access to data. Those problems are being solved. And we're talking about like satellite internet that is essentially giving free internet to the entire developed world within the next few months. It's already rolling out. This is not the far future, it's right here. And when you get to that point, compulsory schooling no longer makes sense. The mindset has to shift from going to school to get educated so that you can become an employee for someone else, to saying, what are you going to do to add value to society? How are you going to tap into the mess that is humanity to add value? And that's the question we should be leaving our children with. How do you add value to society? It's not like how do you collect as much money as possible? That's the sort of crass, simplistic way to look at it. But in order to live a meaningful life, you want to be valuable, which means that somebody actually appreciates you being there more than not. And if we shape the question of what education should be around that, rather than about how do I get a job, we have a much more interesting future ahead of us, and a much more democracy in terms of real power, which is what we're seeing the problems of in the world right now.
But talking in general, I believe that we really need a change of mindset in city administrations in Uganda. You see, the current mentality is that the city governments are just spending departments of the central government. It's a huge cashier's desk that receives money from the central government and then, gives it to whoever is there on the ground. That mentality needs to be changed. Of course, it is also related, there are reasons why such a mentality exists. There is also a need to change the fiscal space of local governments, to give them real fiscal autonomy, to give them real financial means of exercising their competences and conducting local development. But the specific legislative measure on which we are working at the moment with our partners includes revision of the borrowing limits for local governments. At the moment, according with the Local Government Act, that limit is kept at 25% of locally generated annual revenues. Now, as you can imagine, annual revenues in different places in Uganda differ. We have some local governments that produce 5% of their entire budget in local revenues. So the cap is 25% of 5%, not too much, as you understand. So what we suggest is now to link that cap not to the total amount of borrowing, but link it to the amount of service debt on a long-term loan amortized over a period of 10 years. This will help increase the borrowing capacity, the legal borrowing capacity of local governments 5 times. Yes, and will significantly improve their fiscal position. The other measure that, again, we are discussing and we are proposing is to put in place legislation and regulation framework that would allow operation of pooled financing vehicles for local governments. That would allow them, in combination with increasing their borrowing limits, that would allow them to pool their assets, to tap into the domestic capital markets, and again, get additional finances for their development.